The hardest thing about night photography is staying up. The second hardest thing about night photography is operating your camera in the dark with cold wind, mosquitoes, and creepy sounds everywhere. With the Nikon Z series full frame mirrorless cameras, the rest of the process is very easy. And in this video, I'm going to show you how. I'll be using a Nikon Z6ii, but this will work with any of the Nikon Z series cameras. Some of the dials may be in different places, especially with the Nikon Z9. In this video, we're going to cover urban dark photography, night photography in rural environments, focusing at night, and a whole bunch of clever tips and tricks with these cameras, including some deep menu options. So let's begin. All you're going to need is your Nikon Z series camera. The kit lens that came with it will work just fine for most night photography. You're also going to need a tripod and a flashlight. I do also recommend you get an extra battery. The first thing we're going to do is help you get some experience with night photography by starting with urban night shots. And you're going to get some stunning looking images right away. To do this style, we're just going to put our camera in shutter mode. It's right here on your mode dial where it says S. In shutter mode, we're just going to set the shutter speed and let the camera do the aperture and ISO for us. So let's set our camera to auto ISO. On the top of your camera, you're going to see this button. Press and hold this. The back command dial is going to set the value. We're going to use 100. The front command dial turns auto ISO on and off. We're going to leave this on auto. So spin that front command dial till it says A. Now your ISO is all set. When I'm doing urban dark photography, I like to start as soon as the sun goes down, especially during blue hour. I'm going to shoot anywhere from 1 to 30 seconds. My favorite shutter speed is 10 seconds. If you want more streaks from the cars, choose a 30-second exposure. So let's spin our back command dial and set this to 10 seconds. Right now you're probably going to see this value. When you start spinning your command dial, you're going to see your shutter speeds will get slower and slower. This is 1/10 of a second. Then there's 1/3. When you see the inches symbols, that's seconds. So 10 inches is 10 seconds. So all you have to do is put your camera in a tripod, focus, and press the shutter button. It is that simple. If you want to do a shorter exposure, just do a 3-second exposure. If you want to go 30 seconds, spin your command dial to 30 seconds. If your pictures are too bright or too dark, you could also use exposure compensation to brighten or darken your images. On the top of the camera, look for the exposure compensation button. Press and hold it, and spin your back command dial. When you go to -1 value, your pictures will be one stop darker from now on. Or if you choose to go +1, all of your pictures will be one stop brighter from now on. And then of course, press and hold the button and put it back to 0 when you're finished with exposure compensation. The reason why I do this in auto ISO and shutter mode is because it helps speed up the process. When you're doing urban dark photography, sometimes you're placing yourself at risk. The faster you are getting set up, shot, and then gone, the better. That's why I don't use full manual mode. You could take handheld shots of these same buildings, but if you do a handheld shot, you may end up with some motion blur, and you're going to have very high ISO grain. By doing these long exposure photos, you're burning in such a high quality image, people are going to swear you're already a professional. Half your pictures won't work because of street lamps or security lights. Those are things you can't control. And as a bonus, if somebody was walking through your scene while you're shooting, you won't even see them. But most importantly, you're getting experience operating your camera in the dark. And even though autofocus will still work fine, this is a great opportunity for you to learn how to do manually focusing in the dark. And we're going to cover that in just a couple minutes. Now let's get your camera set up for night photography in rural environments. For this, we're going to put our camera in manual mode. Again, it's right here on your mode dial. We're going to set ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. The first value we're going to change is our ISO. You can't use auto ISO for night photography. So let's press and hold the ISO button again. Spin the front command dial to turn auto ISO to off. Now spin the back command dial, and let's get this set to 4000. 4000 is just a basic, simple, easy ISO for most night photography. There is a lot of different opinions about which ISO value to use for night photography, but 4000 is an easy one. Your goal for your first shot is to get a well-exposed image that's in focus. And to this day, I still like using 4000 ISO. The Nikon Z series cameras handle high ISOs very well. Now that you got your ISO set up, we're going to do aperture settings. Aperture is the iris in your lens. For night photography, you want the widest aperture possible to let the most amount of light in. On your camera, you're going to notice these values. Those are f-stops. So let's change this f-stop value to the lowest you can. If you're using the kit lens that came with the camera, make sure your lens is wide open. This way you get the most sky and you can get the widest aperture. Let's spin our front command dial and get that to the lowest value possible. Some of the kit lens that came with your camera, the widest aperture is going to be 3.5. Some of these lenses will be 4. If you happen to have a lens with a wider aperture, get this set to either 2.8 or 2. For your first shot, you're going to use ISO 4000 and the widest aperture possible. Now the next value is going to be your shutter speed. That's why this is the easiest class you'll take, because for your first shot, you're going to choose one of 9 shutter speeds. It's either going to be 30 seconds or it can be as fast as 5 seconds or somewhere in the middle. The shutter speed is going to depend on variables you can't control, like moon phase, cloud coverage, and distance to a city. What I generally do is I start at 30-second exposure and work my way down until it looks correct. You're only going to be changing shutter speeds for your first night shot. The best way to do this is let's set our camera to 30 seconds. If that picture is overexposed, we'll try a 25-second exposure, then 20, 15, 13, 10, 8, or a 5-second exposure. One of those will work. To change these values, let's spin our back command dial. Those values are your shutter speeds. This is 1/50th of a second. If you keep spinning, eventually you're going to get 2 inches symbols. 1 inch is 1 second, which means 30 inches is a 30-second exposure. Now your camera is already set up for your first night shot. All you're going to have to do is put your camera in a tripod, focus, and hit the shutter button. If you're doing these settings at home, the back of your screen is going to be completely white right now. This is because the Nikon Z series cameras have exposure simulation. The settings you have chosen now are going to be too bright for the lighting conditions you have. But when you get out into the country, the back of your camera will look correct for the lighting conditions. So here's an example of a photo I shot when there's a 75% moon. It only needed a 10-second exposure. Here's what it looked like when I took a 30-second exposure. You can tell it's overexposed. And here's what it looked like at a 1-second exposure. You can tell this is definitely underexposed. And here's a very handy feature with this camera. You can use touch shutter if you want. On the back of the camera, look for this icon. Every time you press it, it says something different. You can turn it off, focus point, and one of the options is called touch shutter. When you have touch shutter enabled, instead of pressing the shutter button on the top of the camera, you can gently just touch the back of the screen to begin an exposure. For most of my night photography, I use the touch shutter option. It's a lot easier. And you probably already know this, but you have an articulating screen. You can change most of these camera settings by touching these areas where it's gray, and then adjusting the shutter speeds and aperture rate on the screen. Then press the arrow on the top right-hand corner to go back to your main screen. Also, if you hit the display button a few times, one of the options on here is a leveler. This is really handy for night photography when you're setting up your composition. Now let's go over focusing. There's a lot of very handy features that will make manually focusing in the dark easy. Focusing at night is only hard once. That's why I recommend you do this either at home or in an urban environments before you go to the country. To turn on manual focusing with this camera, it's not done on the lens anymore. It's done in camera. So let's begin by pressing the I button. Once you see this screen, on the bottom right-hand corner, there's focus mode. Press the OK button once you're down here and choose MF. This stands for manual focus. Now that you got your camera set up for manual focus, let's draw attention to the lens. For most of your lenses, there's 2 rings, zoom ring and focus ring. For zoom, always keep your lens wide open to get the most sky. The other ring is your focus ring. When you play with this, things will go in and out of focus. That's really all you need to know, but it does get much easier. The Nikon Z series cameras have a feature called focus peaking. This is going to put red highlights around areas that are in focus. It's an incredibly handy feature when you're focusing at night. So let's turn this on. Press the menu button. Then we're going to use our directional pad and scroll down to the area where it says Custom Setting Menu. Use the right button to access the submenu. Let's scroll down to Shooting Display. Press the OK button once you're here. On this page, there's going to be an option called Focus Peaking. Press the OK button to enter this. Right now, peaking level is set to off. Let's set it to 2 or standard. Once you've got this set, press OK, then touch your shutter button halfway down to return to your main screen. If you're practicing this at home, the back of your screen is still pure white because of your camera settings. If you're going to practice focusing at home in the daylight, switch your camera to aperture mode for the purpose of this lesson. That way you can see on the back of the camera properly again. Now when you play with the focus ring, you're going to see the red highlights around areas that are in focus. This makes night photography focusing so easy. In some cases, this will even work on the brightest stars. But it gets even easier. I don't use focus peaking all the time. Sometimes I use screen magnification instead, especially when I'm focusing on light sources that could be miles away. On the back of your camera, look for this magnification button. Once you press it, your screen will magnify. If you press it a few times, you can magnify up to 8 times. Now play with your focus ring. The focus peaking highlights don't really work when you use screen magnification, but it makes focusing very easy. And you can use your directional pad to move around the screen to find different areas to focus on. I've been able to focus on light sources 20 kilometers away using this method. It's that good. Generally speaking, you want to be able to focus on something 30 feet away from you or further in order to get to infinity focus. Once you're in infinity focus, everything will be in focus except for the immediate few feet in front of you. So using the screen magnification is what I use the most. When you want to return to the main screen again, just press the button underneath screen magnification and it'll zoom back out to your main screen again. But what you're most commonly going to do is you're going to go to the hardware store and get a really bright flashlight. Then you're going to shine it on subjects that you want to focus on. That's how I do most of my focusing at night. And with this camera, with focus peaking and screen magnification, the whole process is very simple. Because your camera does have exposure simulation in it, it's highly recommended you do your camera settings first, then focus. If you try using daytime camera settings at night to focus, you won't be able to see anything. And it gets even easier. You don't have to do all your camera settings out in the country. Before you even leave your house, get your camera settings set up. Do your ISO, aperture, shutter speed, and place your camera in manual focus. That way, all you have to do is drive out to your location, put your camera on a tripod, get composed, focus, then press your shutter button. It can't get any easier than that. Then all you have to do is make adjustments to your shutter speed when needed. You can also save these user settings to your camera. You may have noticed on your mode dial, there's user 1, user 2, and 3. Let's save these settings to user 1. So let's make sure our camera's back to manual mode. Your ISO is back to 4000, your aperture is at the widest possible, and you're at a 30-second exposure. And of course, you still got your camera set to manual focus. Press the menu button and scroll down to where it says Setup menu. Once you're down here, the second option is called Save User Settings. Let's scroll over here and press OK. I'm going to save my camera settings to user 1. Once you've got your camera settings saved to user 1, anytime you spin your command dial to user 1, all these settings will still be there for you. Another option your camera has is called extended shutter speeds. With some of the older Z series cameras, you might have to do a firmware update in order to get extended shutter speeds. To activate it, let's press the menu button. Let's go back down to Custom Setting menu, and then Shooting and Display. One of the options in here is called Extended Shutter Speeds. Let's turn this on. Once you've set up focus peaking and extended shutter speeds, you only have to do this once. You don't have to keep doing this over and over. Now let's press our shutter button halfway down to go back to the main screen. With extended shutter speeds enabled, you can spin your back command dial and get 60 seconds, 90 seconds. You can go all the way up to 15 minutes. But just so you know, with the kit lens that came with this camera, once you go beyond 25-second exposures, you'll probably start noticing star trails in your images. And if you are going to start taking 3, 5, or 10-minute exposures, you should keep your ISO values between 1 to 400. But this is very handy for people who like doing painting with light. If you keep spinning your command dial, one of your shutter speeds is called time. When you're in time mode, you can start and end an exposure whenever you want. This is really handy when you're doing irregular shutter speeds. If you've enabled touch shutter on your camera, all you have to do is gently touch the screen to start an exposure, then you can come back 45 seconds later, 2 minutes later, or even 20 minutes if you want to, and touch the screen again to end the exposure. I use this option a lot, especially when I'm doing painting with light. Once you've taken an exposure, you can hit the play button to see the picture you just took. Then you can use your finger to swipe the screen to see all the pictures. And if you want to magnify the screen to see some details, just double tap in one of the areas. Then you can use your finger to drag around and look at all the different areas to make sure it's in focus. Then double tap again to return to the main screen. When you're a beginner, don't worry about night events, like auroras or shooting stars. You just want to be able to get a well-exposed image that's in focus, a simple astral landscape. And if you're a beginner, it's also better when you go when there's a bright moon or really thick, low clouds. The more light, the better for your first shot. And once you're out there shooting at night, your eyes adjust for the night sky. So the image you're going to see on the back of the camera at night tends to be brighter than what the image will really look like when it's on your computer. That's why I tend to take 3 exposures. If a 10-second exposure looks great here, I'm going to go ahead and take a 13, then a 15-second exposure as well to have a couple more that are even brighter. The Nikon Z series cameras can actually shoot the Milky Way pretty good with the kit lens that came with it. But they are grainier because you're going to have to shoot those at 10,000 ISO. If you want to upgrade your night photography experience, you can invest in one of 2 lenses. Nikon makes a 20mm prime lens with an aperture value of 1.8. That's 4 times more light than the kit lens that came with this camera. When you use a lens like this, you can shoot the Milky Way at low ISO values like 3200. I used the Sigma 20mm version. I bought it when I used the Nikon DSLR cameras, so I have to use that adapter ring. These 20mm wide aperture lenses are absolutely amazing, but you only really need to use these lenses when you're shooting in dark sky areas, especially Milky Ways. They're so amazing that you can actually film video at night on bright moon phases. Another tip is, while I was filming this video, I did notice that when I'm focusing in video mode, the screen is cleaner. If you're having trouble focusing at night because of all the grain on your screen, switch your camera to video mode, then get focused, then switch your camera back to camera mode to take your photo. I'm not sure why the screen is cleaner in video mode than it is in camera mode, but I hope they do a future firmware upgrade to fix this problem. Once you're done your night photography, there's 2 things you must do. You got to grab your big bright flashlight and look around and make sure you brought everything home. It's very easy to forget things if you can't see them. The second thing I do is I put my camera back to daytime settings. If you got your settings set to user 1, no problem. Just put your camera back to aperture mode or wherever you had it before and you should be fine. But you're going to want to make sure your ISO is back to 100 and that you turn auto ISO back to on. Further, you're going to have to make sure you're back in autofocus. So let's press the I button, go back to focus mode, and change this back to AFS. If you don't put your camera settings back tonight, you'll forget tomorrow. I'll be making a whole bunch of shorter videos on just some other specific tips and tricks with this camera, and I'm going to be demonstrating some light painting techniques I'm going to use with my Nikon Z6ii. So subscribe to my channel if you want to see all those. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions or comments, leave it in the comment section below. And if you happen to get a really good night shot, please tag me on Instagram so I can see it. Thank you so much for joining me tonight, and good luck with your night photography.